Welcome everybody. I'm Alexandra, and on behalf of the Displacement Tracking Matrix team here at IOM, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this International Women's Day event, Gender and Beyond, Unlocking the Potential of Data. For those of you unfamiliar, DTM collects data on displaced and migrant populations in situations of active humanitarian crisis and post-crisis contexts. So today, I would like to give special thanks to the panelists for their time, for being here and sharing their wide knowledge with us. Thank you as well to my colleagues Nikki Herwanger and Liz Griesmer for their work in preparation for this event. So the panelists today, first we have Masumi Yamashima. Masumi is the founder and executive director of Tsunago Network, a consultancy specializing in developing solutions to improve outcomes for children-focused humanitarian programming. Tsunago Network focuses on protection and human rights, working specifically on gender-based violence, gender and inclusion, as well as in the technical areas such as education, health, nutrition, and WASH. Masumi has worked on child protection, gender-based violence, and protection from sexual exploitation and abuse with organizations such as UNICEF, International Federation of Red Cross, and the Japanese Red Cross, and it was engaged with analysis and programs in a number of contexts, including Afghanistan, China, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe. Ro'i Shaul Hillel is a mental health and psychosocial support and protection specialist, working with the UNICEF-led Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility. Ro'i is a licensed social worker focusing on mental health and sexual trauma, particularly interested in the implementation and development of psychosocial services to children in humanitarian emergencies. Ro'i was involved in the immediate aftermath of the 2015 Nepal earthquake, where he designed and implemented psychosocial intervention programs, specifically focusing on youth support. He also served for ISRAID as head of mission to Puerto Rico after the Hurricane Maria in 2017, where he also led the organization's intervention plan. So Roi's primary focus has also been on the promotion of LGBTQIA+ friendly mental health services, in addition to ongoing work with people from communities coping with serious and persistent mental illnesses. Then we have Kayla McFarland-Diaz, who is a researcher at RESAMA, the Red Sudamericana para las Migraciones Ambientales. That is the South American Network for Environmental Migrations. RESAMA is an organization dedicated to giving visibility and working for the recognition and protection of people displaced in the context of disasters and climate change since 2010. Kayla has a background in public law and has worked on legislative aspects of environmental and disaster displacement, as well as government integrating climate concerns for migration policies moving forward. Then we have Benedetta Cordaro. She is the lead analyst at the Joint Intersectoral Analysis Framework, known as JAF. The GIAF is a new approach to developing a methodology to analyze the multiple needs of populations in crisis, providing estimates of the magnitude of the crisis, severity of crises, and analysis of vulnerability and its principal drivers. The GIAF's aim, and through this the work, is to move beyond the sector-by-sector lens and integrate analysis to give an overview of needs that is based on the experience of affected populations. So today, we have an opportunity to integrate questions of intersectionality when looking at the gender dimensions of disaster displacement and environmental migration. So just to get an idea, we are launching a poll. You should see it on your screen now. We would just like to get an idea of how familiar the audience is with the term intersectionality. So feel free to add your input. So, wow, we have a very, very even spread. So about half would say familiar, and the rest is pretty equally split between not familiar and very familiar. So that is a good spread, good for us to know for the conversation moving forward. So just to give you an idea, we first wanted to credit the history of the term, its origins, and how it's evolved since. So the term hails from the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who made significant contributions to the underlying concepts for critical race theory. Crenshaw's research, based in the 1980s and early 1990s, focused on legal cases that identified a pattern of discrimination against Black female employees in the United States. She argued that their racial and gender identities intersected to add layers of discrimination to their experience under the law. Since then, the term intersectionality has been applied to other contexts to describe how the different aspects of a person's identity, be it race, ethnicity, ability status, religion, and beyond, move and affect the layers of discrimination that compound to create obstacles, resulting in greater injustices for groups and individuals. Today's discussion will center on understanding how this power and marginalization manifests when it comes to human mobility, as well as understanding its gendered impacts and going beyond to see how experiences of displacement and environmental migration can benefit from better data collection. We will discuss through various different contexts with a view of informing better responses. So now I would like to give the floor to the panelists, starting with the first question to lay the ground, which is what intersectionality means in terms of humanitarian data collection and analysis, and why it's important for understanding climate change related migration and disaster displacement. So perhaps Benedetta, you want to take the floor on this?
Well, thank you very much for your question, and I also pick the opportunity to thank again DTM for organizing this event and inviting me. I'm here speaking as I was introduced as the GIAF lead analyst, so I will try as much as possible to address these questions also from a GIAF perspective, but having a background in social research, I will try also to integrate. But I will try to make it clear what is my opinion, and what is how the GIAF is planning to move. So when it comes to intersectionality, especially within the context of the GIAF, I think it's important that you remember that we're speaking in our case of a secondary data analysis exercise, whose purpose is very clear. It's a very action-oriented, operational kind of analysis and research. So from the perspective of humanitarian response and analysis that informs that response, intersectionality as a lens is paramount. And it's paramount, I would say, from two main perspectives. First of is how a different shock impacts as a different effect on people depending on their profile. So it may be that a different shock, which in this case, in this event, we are speaking especially of climate change, but it can be any sort of shock. It could be military clashes, for instance, might have a very direct, different impact on people depending on their features, their personal characteristics, be they the group to which they belong or personal features and so on. And the second aspect is how after a shock, when a response is taking place and is being planned, the second aspect is how can we respond better? How can we plan a response that is working better, addressing the most affected people, not only targeting the right people, but also with the right modalities. And this is where intersectionality becomes very, very important. When it comes specifically to climate change, I think it is important also to for everybody in the audience to remember that it's sometimes very difficult to grasp from an external audience that climate change that is sometimes slow, sometimes it's the remote cause of something that is rapid, such as a cyclone, but sometimes it may be very slow as a shock. It can be the cause of a slow onset crisis, for instance, drought. It's very hard for people to basically grasp the idea that a natural event can have a different impact on people depending, for instance, on their gender or depending on their age. Having said so, I think that while it is very important to apply intersectionality in this sort of secondary analysis that informs planning for humanitarian responses, it is also true that we do face some challenges in the application of this specific theory. About the operational challenges, I suppose we can speak more later, but when it comes to the conceptual challenges, let's say, I personally identified roughly 3, just to be, just try to keep it concise. So first off, there is a widespread misunderstanding of what intersectionality is. Meaning that while there is a lot of goodwill, I think, and definitely there have been a lot of progress in the past years in terms of inclusion, in terms of integrating data collection of analysis that take into account different population groups. Sometimes it is overly simplified, so the risk of just falling into let's collect data on women and people with disabilities is behind the corner, while in reality intersectionality is much more than just that. I mean, it's definitely positive, the fact that we finally collect information about a certain categories. I don't want to dismiss that, but intersectionality is not fully understood if we just stop there. Another aspect is that there is not always a great attention to driving factors. So when we speak of people's vulnerabilities, how people are more or less discriminated, have more or less access to services, we sometimes stop just to the profiling of the people and not on the driving factors that lead these people to actually have issues in accessing services or are discriminated and so on. And then finally, some topics are generally left out. So you mentioned at the beginning that intersectionality was born within critical race theory. Well, the word, allow me, race or the ethnic identities or religious identities are a bit of a taboo sometimes in the humanitarian sector. It has to do also with neutrality. It has to do with the sensitivity, the high sensitivity of the topic. So sometimes data is not even collected about that. Sometimes it is and kept very safe, because if disseminated, it might be it goes into a problem of harming the people that we are supposed to help. But overall, I would say that some of the components of intersectionality are just not included. So I would say that overall, the problem is that in terms of profiling the most vulnerable in the humanitarian sector, we tend to focus very much on the who, sometimes a bit in let's say in prepackaged boxes, I would say, but like, let's say, women, children, people with disabilities, old people and so on, while we could expand definitely on that, but we don't really focus too much on the why. And this is actually a point on which the GIF on which we're working now, the GIF in this moment is developing a second version, AGF 2.0, a further iteration of this methodology. This is something that this new methodology is actually looking to a lot, especially how different needs overlap, how vulnerabilities are determined, and how especially causality should be taken into account. So this is a why factor that I was mentioning before. I hope I managed to reply without taking too much time.
No, thank you, Benedetta. That was excellent in terms of the considerations we have to keep in mind, trying to unravel how this term can help us understand better the ramifications of climate change related migration, disaster displacement. Perhaps, Kayla, on your knowledge of how governments are dealing with this data collection, how do you think that intersectionality is important for understanding these dynamics?
Of course. Well, firstly, thank you, Alexandra, for the opportunity. And I am extremely honored to be here today and being part of such a distinguished panel of people that I very much admire and whose work is making an impact. So I'm very happy to be here today. In terms of your question concerning the impact intersectionality can have in governmental approach to the collection of data, well, firstly, I want to mention that I'm also speaking on behalf of Erika Pires Ramos, the founder of HESEMA. She unfortunately wasn't able to join the panel today due to health circumstances, but she extends her gratitude for the opportunity and for the recognition of her work, of our work. And yes, and well, continuing with my point in terms of how intersectionality can influence governmental approaches, the largest project carried out currently by HESEMA is the Latin American Observatory on Human Mobility, Disasters and Climate Change. And this is carried out in partnership with the University of Peace, with the objective of mapping the existent data within the region of Latin America. So 6 countries were analyzed, and the The study focused on the availability, the quality, and the accessibility of data, studying countries such as Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Mexico. And a critical concern of the team of researchers was that data was virtually not disaggregated, which was an issue. So number one, there was the issue of the lack of a category in order to protect people that are displaced due to environmental and climatic threats. And a second layer of difficulty was that data wasn't disaggregated. So it was very difficult to access data on how many women were migrating, how many people with disabilities, how age impact displacement, how socioeconomic conditions impacted people's decision to migrate, or to what extent they were forced to migrate. So in terms of how intersectionality could impact governmental approach, for us at Hizam, it is very interesting to develop projects really emphasizing how intersectionality can also impact the understanding of climate migration. As Benedetta was mentioning earlier, it's such a complex issue, and its nature is so multidimensional that it becomes extremely difficult to break it down, and governments lack resources or lack the political will to understand the phenomenon. So we believe that intersectionality could be an angle that could bring this multi-dimensional nature of climate migration before governments, in order to deconstruct it and for it to become more understandable to them, and for data to be collected accordingly.
That's great. Thank you. I think we definitely, the point of data disaggregation is super important, and we'll definitely be delving into that some more. Perhaps may I ask the other panelists, from your experiences working with disaster displacement, what do you think are the most particular amplified vulnerabilities that occur in disaster displacement, and how can this intersectional approach bring more to light about how these vulnerabilities are developing in crisis and perhaps post-crisis scenarios?
Can I jump in, Alex? So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm also very happy and honored to be there. Maybe may I answer one first question about intersectionalities, and then I'll also give the one big statement that really impacted my work, and then others too. So one, for the intersectionality, for me is really simply a good programming. As Benedict said, if we don't know who is impacted the most, who are not accessing information, why they are impacted and so on, we cannot simply make good programming. So sometimes we think a lot and too much, but it's simply a good programming. And also for humanitarian context, it means inclusive data collection, analysis, and interpretation, not only by the different sectors working together like JF, but also who we collect information. Because in the humanitarian, we oftentimes collect information from those who are available and accessible, and they are not the most vulnerable populations. So it's really important that we have inclusive data collection and analysis, which means that there are different groups of people, could be local women's organizations, persons with disabilities organization, LGBTI community, etc., participate from the already planning and data collection, data analysis, and interpretation, so that people can really understand well what's happening in the community. And without that, we really cannot make really good programming, coming back to the first point. And I really think also they are good to data analysis, like the good data can really bring human face. So the question you asked about how they are kind of intersectionalities and the pre-existing vulnerability amplifies, there's a research, and IFRC is also using this data, that the women and children are 14 times more likely than adult men to die in disaster. That is really shocking data. And if we didn't, there was no disaggregated data and analysis, we didn't know the data. But also more important is that not only that, if there is gender equalities before the emergencies, the men's and the women are, how to say, the mortality rate for men and women during and post emergencies are relatively the same. So it really gives, I think the data gives really so it really the pre-existing vulnerability tells everything, dictate how people are, how to say, affected and then respond and then, and recover. So it's really important. And again, this kind of data can really bring the human face to the data and then really, I think, push people to move. Thank you.
Absolutely. If I may just jump in, I think that the point on interpretation is extremely important because intersectionality is not meant to be, we're not here to have a conversation about what's the blueprint for intersectionality and let's apply it to climate migration and its gendered impacts and beyond. So thank you for raising that point and focusing on how it can inform better responses. Roy, you probably have more to add on informing better responses, so I'll let you take the floor.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for arranging this panel as well. I think when we're looking also from a gender perspective, when we're looking at the LGBTQ community, I think when we're collecting data on queer individuals, we usually see that there's underrepresented data, and that's because people are closeted, people are coming from communities where they're not accepted, and it's really tough to collect data on them, right? So when you're thinking about humanitarian context, I think the main things that are amplified are, first of all, the barriers that they have to access services, and I think that's the main test that we need to look at, how much people can access services in a certain situation, and where we're thinking about gender affirming care, for example, in migration, right? When we're thinking about trans people and access to hormones, access to medications, that's usually the thing that organization would think about last, if at all. And it's really easy to also put it kind of hidden because it's so not represented. So I think that's the main thing. And another thing from a gender perspective, I think domestic violence and gender-based violence, both for women, for LGBTQ people, violence against children, the whole impact on mental health about migration, right? And I think that a lot of times when people talk about migration that is related to climate change, they're trying to see what are the specific results of climate change on migration. But I think when we're looking at migration as a phenomena, so mental health is mental health, right? So when you are moving to a new place, your social ties are being destroyed. Your sense of community, if you have one, is being destroyed. And if you don't have one, if you're coming from an urban setting and you don't have a sense of community, that's even more harmful, right? And the way that it affects intergenerational trauma, the way they affect PTSD, or even, when I'm going to a new place and the struggles that I go through until I get there, how vulnerable I am to being exploited on my way to a new place. And I think there are so many different factors that data collection is not assessing correctly. And we will talk more later about the disaggregation and what factors we're using in data collection. But I do think that when we're actually able to pinpoint what are the intersectional identities of people, we can actually make services more tailor-made to approach all of these things.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think the concerns you just mentioned also have an impact on influencing decisions to migrate, availability of protection services and things like that. Benedetta, would you like to add anything on amplifying the pre-existing vulnerabilities, or perhaps understanding the kind of differences between looking at intersectionality when we talk about on the individual level and individual needs, and how this can inform better design, but also if we're looking perhaps at on a larger level, perhaps at a camp level or beyond.
So when it comes to, let's say, vulnerabilities that get exacerbated, I think that here we go back to discuss about the context analysis, right? So especially in the humanitarian sector, a big challenge is that very operationally, typically a researcher or an analyst is not necessarily someone who has been living in that country for 10 years and understand the inside out of the entire society. Very often you will have someone who just move from country to country, from emergency to emergency every couple of years. And this person inevitably cannot have an in-depth understanding of the local society. So this is already a challenge, because when you speak of pre-existing vulnerabilities, you do need to know what those vulnerabilities were. And this very often doesn't happen. And this is, again, a bit what I was saying before about it's great that we try to collect disaggregated data. This is absolutely great. But the risk of just considering this as a pre-existing boxes in which you will put a number into the women box and a number into the people with disability box. And then most importantly, and here we go back to the whole challenge about understanding intersectionality, we don't really reflect about how being a woman and disabled at the same time cause, let's say, problems in accessing services or being discriminated, which is the whole point of intersectionality, understanding how these factors coexist and how a person is discriminated because these personal characteristics exist at the same time. And this might change from one country to another country. In one country, being a young boy of the age of 12 might mean being considered as a potential victim because the person is a child, hence inoffensive. In another country, this is considered a potentially young soldier, so the treatment that this person will receive will be completely different. So this is where the context analysis become extremely important. It's not enough to just, disaggregated data is important, but unless it is contextualized, we do not understand why things happen. So I would think I can stop here, at least for, I hope I managed to reply to this.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on this?
If I may.
Go ahead.
With relation to the second part of your question, Alexandra, on how to better improve policies at the camp level, for instance, I think, well, something I did want to mention in relation to this is the lack of gender-sensitive relief being deployed in the aftermath of certain disasters. For instance, well, it's a bit of an older example, but when the Hurricane Mitch hit Nicaragua, if I recall correctly, the aid deployed was very much distributed on the basis of gender. So men exercised almost exclusive control and management over these resources, meaning that women, their needs, and not only their needs, but also their capacities and their experience that they could contribute to the recovery phase were absolutely ignored and excluded. So I believe in terms of the need of gender sensitive relief, intersectionality could play an important role. Also, to adduce a more recent example, after the 2020 Hurricane Iota, the most affected regions in Nicaragua presented exorbitantly high rates of child pregnancies, femicides, gender-based violence. And most of these cases were reported within the shelter, so within the camps. So it would be a very interesting, maybe for the Q&A part, to discuss how to better integrate intersectionality as a tool to design policies that are protecting women, children, and other marginalized groups within these camps, because they're subjected to discrimination, abuse, and violence. So I believe that this also ties into what intersectionality is and how it speaks about mutually reinforcing inequalities and injustices. So it could be an interesting approach for further discussion later, how to, from the different perspectives of the panelists, to further discuss intersectionality as a very important tool for development.
Absolutely. I think the considerations for emergency shelter and how GBV and other associated dynamics can play out are very relevant. Roy, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just a really quick thing. I think that oftentimes we also see, and especially in MHBSS, in mental health and psychosocial support services, we see a lot of guidelines and toolkits being developed. And they're being developed to target specific populations. And what happens is international organizations take them, kind of adapt them without seeing the broader cultural context. And I think that in the sense of preparedness, because we're talking a lot about response, in the sense of preparedness and actually understanding how can we apply those guidelines to a post-disaster setting, I think that's the most important part of adapting these services, because otherwise you're just taking a certain service and copying it in different settings, and you might miss so many people who will not have access to these services.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think the importance of guidelines is crucial for paving the way forward. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about how quite often it is cited that the issue with climate migration, specifically environmental migration or climate-induced displacement, whether disaster or slow onset, is the lack of legislative frameworks at a national level, regional level, global level, and that has maybe in some occasions stifled a path forward. So looking beyond the often cited that this is the barrier, how can we focus on data collection, data analysis, operability on the ground to pave a way for more significant strides to be made in this field? Masumi, maybe you want to take the lead on this.
Sure, thank you so much. So I think it's also, I think we've already discussed that the good data analysis and then really from the intersectionality lens would really give us a good information of who are most affected and why they're affected and how they're coping and who are accessing, not accessing services. So I think this availability of this level of information can really encourage, I think, legislators to take actions. It's not really the, how to say, climate change, migration context, but for example, there's a lot of data helped to understand, for example, invisibility of girls in associated with armed forces and groups, and that's really changes the criteria, for example, in internationally to identify girls. And I think a lot of work is now happening for girls on the move as well, because a certain, like adolescent girls are very invisible, even though they are there and they are really vulnerable to GBV, the other exploitation and so on, but they were invisible. But with those data available, lots of, I think, good researches and analysis and then that helps identify who are vulnerable and who are invisible in data. It really helped, I think, changing the standards and criteria. So I think, yes, this good data and good research is really using the intersectionality lens would help to generate good evidence to push people to take action.
Thank you. Can I just add on to that another question on, given the capacities as well in a quick moving environment, how do you think that, efforts can be made to keep a level of granularity despite the quick movement?
I think for me, the biggest, I think, thing is just to work with the diverse group of people. They are the expert of their issues. That sometimes we spend so much time how to do this work and this. They know their situation. They know what works the best. So I think especially in these early stages of emergency, where there's no systems, good data collections and so on, it's important to, I think, work with the various local organizations because they are the ones who can really tell us and then to guide us.
Thank you. Benedetta, feel free to jump in.
Thank you. I just wanted to, well, at this point, I reply to both your questions. So when it comes to the legislative definition, I think it would be interesting, especially when it comes to studying climate-induced migration, and if in the optics of through the prism, let's say, of of intersectionality is try to distinguish 1 second what is a remote cause of something, and which means, for instance, I think that at a political level, sometimes it's very easy to just basically the way in which climate change is, climate-induced migration is disregarded is by calling it economic migration, as if this was a personal choice that someone with all options in this world will anyway choose to migrate. And so providing evidence that there is an element of the person is forced in a certain way to take that decision definitely might help in shaping more the legal definition. On the other hand, I think it's important, and this is where intersectionality can be applied, to distinguish the analysis that someone does on the remote causes for advocacy purposes, for instance, and the or for policy making, and sometimes the more immediate analysis that you need to conduct to provide assistance right now. Because if you are in Libya and you're assisting people who are stranded migrants, at some point you don't care why they got in Libya. You're trying to address the problem they're facing in that specific moment. And if they have a need in that moment, how they got there is not your primary concern. You need to assist them. Basically, I would simply say that you can break down the kind of analysis you do, the kind of data collection that you do, depending also on what is your ultimate purpose. And when it comes to the aspects of granularity, I think that it is important for us to just accept, and this is when it's important, in my opinion, when it comes to intersectionality. It's important to accept that not everything can be quantified, and not everything can be quantified on day one. In basically any sort of prevalence information about the violence, which can be like sexual violence, it can be other forms of abuse and so on, typically is underreported and very difficult to spot. As Masumi was saying before, if I remember correctly, the most vulnerable are typically the hardest to reach, so we don't get information from them. So probably also accepting that granularity and quantitative information might not be what you need on day one of a response, at least. It might be something that you need the time. Just accepting that this is the case might already be a good step, but also understanding that you have other ways to get there. So if I see, I'm going to be I'm going to give a very simplistic example, okay, but at least I try to explain what I mean. If I am in a hotspot of irregular migration that has always been the typical departure point of irregular migration to a certain country, and all of a sudden I have a refugee camp with 10,000 unaccompanied minors, I don't need to count them to say that they're all potentially exposed to trafficking. It's enough for me to know that those 3 factors are in the same place and I say they are at risk, and my policies, my actions, the kind of assistance I will put in place will be determined by that, by a very context-related qualitative analysis. So similarly, you don't set up a clinic to assist the victim of sexual abuse only after you have counted all of them. You actually hope that that you can do also prevention activities. So let's say that the whole point is a lot of I think that we needed to get out of the tunnel and accept the idea that we don't intervene only based on numbers. We don't do that normally. So just being obsessed on having the most granular information and quantitative information from day one, this is what I want to stress, that from day one might not be just the way to go. It might be something that we aim to achieve after some time, because you do need evidence for long-term policies. But I'm speaking for a humanitarian response point of view. You don't need all those numbers on day one. Also because they would be very misleading. Over to you.
Thank you for that, also signaling the conflations between environmental and economic migration that can at times be harmful. And of course, the distinctions between the quantitative and qualitative features of data collection in these contexts. So I guess this also opens up the discussion on disaggregation, and perhaps Kayla and Roy are excited to jump in on this, but I wanted to address this question to all the panelists of how disaggregation of data can be, I mean, it is often advanced as a recommendation to be more responsive and, you know, create a better idea of the division of needs. So I would address the question to say, how do you understand the relationship between disaggregation and intersectionality. So I'm not saying we have to say it's a good thing or a bad thing, but what are the elements involved? And do you think it can support an intersectional approach, or alternatively, what are the conflicts between these two approaches? I don't know who would like to jump on that first. Roy, go ahead.
I can go, thank you. I will join what Benedetta said before also, which I think is a really good point. When we're looking at data that is not being updated all the time, we can kind of miss how we also design services. And I think in that sense, like when I'm thinking about mental health and what you were just asking, we can want to assess the mental health conditions of kids straight away, right? But A, it changes. B, there are some things that we just cannot diagnose or identify straight away. And I think that if we take this approach of using a lot of face-to-face qualitative surveys, all the methods that we know of, but to collect different data in different times and how they shift as well, that can also affect funding and how much funding is being directed to these things. And I think in relation to disaggregation, I think on one hand, yes, obviously it brings up a lot of cultural sensitivity, a lot of gender sensitivity. It also doesn't put enough complexity, I think, in cases. We're trying to put people in boxes. And again, I was talking before about LGBTQ people. I think that's probably the hardest thing. Like, how do you measure their, how do you measure gender dysphoria, right? How do you measure that in a humanitarian setting? How do you label gender in a non-binary way? Or how can you even take a feminist approach into humanitarian aid and put it in disaggregation of data? Because even if you're going to have 12 different boxes to tick from, it's still very binary, right? On one hand. On the other hand, funding doesn't come otherwise. And I think the main response that I find it useful is to use as much qualitative surveys as possible and qualitative different methodologies, but also I think we talked about it before, but using grassroots organizations' data can also be more beneficial than starting all over again. And even if we're talking about post-migration, we're talking about a community moving to a new place, using prior data to base on it and then update it can be more accurate than just finding new categories to break them down into. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the idea of that we don't have to create something completely new, but just adapt existing methods to meet current needs, or the current evolving understanding of needs is definitely what we're looking towards. Kayla, did you, or Masumi, or did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So for the data disaggregation, I think this is really the first step. Without the disaggregated data, you can't really analyze the data, who is impacted, who is accessing services or not. And that also tells really who we are not seeing. For example, if you see this migrants, there's no, for example, girls, teenage girls are included in any migration data. It's a red flag. We need to consider that something is wrong, that maybe the data collection systems, the definitions or something. So it really, I think it is really the starting point, that disaggregate data as much as possible by sex, age, disabilities, and like other categories is, I think, important to do. Is important to analyze the data. But as also Benedetta mentioned, it's not enough. We need to understand the context. Why, for example, what makes, for example, the social norms related to the decision making and the access to the asset, and then the controls and behavior, because that's really explains why, for example, certain people are not accessing, or why certain people are more affected by our, let's say, our disaster. So the contextual information is equally important so that the disaggregated data start meaning sense why this is happening. And the thirdly, also, We also oftentimes forget, I'm also mentioned the at the beginning, but from whom we collect information are really important. We need to know that the information needs to come from the people who are affected. So the, children's, girls, women's, disabilities, women in minority groups, and so on, because they are the expert of their informations, but also how we collect information is important. If you are just ask the survey questions, we will lose the, let's say, if we only focus on quantitative information, we will lose the important contextual information. So one, disaggregated data is the first steps, but it's not enough that we need contextual information. We need to really be careful how and from whom we collect information and how we analyze and interpret data, to have a very good overview. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. On the contextual data, perhaps the question on disaggregation for Benedetta and Kayla can be expanded a bit. So when we're talking about not only disaggregation of data, but putting it into context, perhaps, what are the other data included that we can use to enhance gender disaggregated understanding? So Kayla, before you were talking about increased rate of femicides. I'm just curious, perhaps, what potential other examples can you think of that have like a robust data behind it that can be kind of triangulated to create a more intersectional lens?
Thank you, Alexandra, for the question, and also to my colleagues in the panel for all their very interesting points being raised. I firstly wanted to elaborate, if I may, and then I can circle back to your question, Alexandra, on Benedetta's point about the issue, if I may term it like that, of researchers going from one place to another, being in a constant move, one could say, and maybe struggle to 100% understand the circumstances of the region that they are studying. This is something that HISM, in their partnership with UP, so as part of the observatory, it was something that they very much acknowledge. Therefore, as opposed to maybe bringing different researchers from abroad, they selected researchers on the ground, so researchers in these 6 different countries, and this meant that they could work with communities, tying into Masumi's point also that we have to also rely on the communities because they best know their needs, they best know what approaches could be implemented to better improve their situations and attend to their different specific needs. So I just wanted to bring this point in terms of the importance of relying on people on the grounds and the crucial need of uplifting and also funding the work of people at the grassroots. Amplifying their work is I believe, one of the best ways forwards in terms of collecting and analyzing data. But in terms of your question about yes, the segregated data. Something that, so recently Eric and I worked on an expert report focusing on the gender dimension of migration, focusing on Latin America as our case study. And something that was a recurring issue was the difficulty of quantifying data of indigenous peoples that are impacted by environmental displacement. And this was a very interesting approach because, well, all groups that are all communities that are displaced have their own means of life. They're very much connected to their regions, but particularly if we speak about indigenous people. So I believe here the intersectional lens could be applied in a way that could act as a bridge in terms of understanding their needs and how to really listen to their concerns and develop prevention strategies, which is also something that was mentioned earlier, I think, and that's maybe a different for a different later time. But in terms of prevention, I very much agree with what Benedetta said. We can't wait to have the statistics. We can't wait to have the evidence to act because it might be too late. So I think it's a very, in terms of that, it was very difficult to find concrete evidence and information. And for instance, in the case of Brazil, my home country, in the case of Brazil, it gives the government much power to absolutely neglect this situation. So the intersection of indigenous injustice and the violation of their rights, environmental migration, and also gender, because indigenous women are disproportionately impacted by this. So I don't know if that's very much went in with the answer that
Absolutely.
you were looking for, but I thought it would be an interesting angle to add, because once again, as all my my colleagues have added before, it's a very much of a complex and multidimensional phenomenon. So we have to take all of these things into consideration. It's many layers. I also agree with what was said about not putting people into boxes, because it's not as black and white as it can be painted by certain actors.
Absolutely. I think, as we all are aware, there have been a lot of movements of influencing government on indigenous land policies, land use, sustainability. Benedetta, you have your hand up.
I wanted to integrate a bit, maybe complement a bit what has been said. And I was thinking of your question about, in general, how do we compensate for lack of information, but also wanted to throw there a problem related to disaggregation. So about how we do compensate, for instance, again, I keep on adopting here a very strong humanitarian emergency lens. If I was working in development, if I was working in a fully developed economy and I had all resources at disposal, I would probably be suggesting something different. But something that, for instance, the protection cluster and the child protection cluster, GBV, AOR, counter-trafficking in IUM adopts quite widely is a socio-ecological model, so that you can try to understand how an individual vulnerability to a certain risk is mitigated or exacerbated depending on multiple factors that are not just individual features, are also community features, are structural features, are legal features, are family or factors related to the family or the household. So sometimes I feel like that if you think of research as kind of putting together a puzzle and you don't really know yet how the final picture is going to look like, at least you can start from what you know. So for instance, you don't need to have individual-based interviews, quantitative interviews from an individual from a group, ethnic group A, that has moved to an area typically controlled from ethnic group B, to know that if you know the history of that country, A and B has been slaughtering each other for centuries, and maybe having to move into that area because of floods, it's very unlikely that the host community is going to receive them well, right? You don't need to have an individual-based interview telling you, I feel afraid of the host community, to guess that that might be the very likely outcome. So in this way, at least you set an hypothesis that then you can go and verify. But again, you cannot expect that at the beginning of a crisis, you just roll out these never-ending assessments in which at an individual, which almost never happen, at a household level more frequently, you will receive all the answers to any questions you might have. And so in this way, by looking at other layers in society, you can think of it. You can think, if this population has no work permit to work here, inevitably they're going to be more likely to be exploited. But I don't need to ask the individual, do you feel like you're more likely to be exploited? I have all the structural factors that allow me to understand that. And when it comes to, I wanted to add 2 points here. One was on the disaggregation boxes that you were describing before. I think it's really important to understand the context, also because you might incur into 2 problems. One is that we tend to leave out, as I was mentioning before, some dimensions. Some dimensions in the humanitarian sectors are not touched. So I'm just making a random list. If you belong to a caste rather than another caste, if you have a certain education background or not, if you belong to a social class, which in some countries is still considered something very important. If you have some tribal affiliation, we hardly ever capture any of that. That might actually have a massive impact on the coping strategies of a family, of a group, and so on. The other point is, and that you understand it also only if you know the context well. The other point is that there are some contexts in which it's absolutely not ideal to go and collect the granular data. and finger point the person belonging to that group. Because if you do work in a country where if you belong to an LGBTQI community, you're killed in the street. You don't go around looking for them.
I'm just going to jump in because actually you're really speaking to the point that I wanted to link to next, which is on data protection concerns. So just as you had described how affiliations can be quite sensitive, and in some cases it doesn't make sense, or it is kind of prohibitive to collect this type of data because of data protection concerns in certain contexts, working with governments, things like this. So
that is
if you want to add to that. Yeah.
So that is actually a crucial point. At least again, I'm thinking of it also from the humanitarian perspective, because you might be able to collect data and store them safely and not disseminate them, use them only for your own implementation, let's say. Or you might also need, as a humanitarian actor, to ask yourself, do I have all the tools I need to collect this data safely without putting the respondent at risk, and then store this data safely so that nobody can access it? Because a lot of organizations with the best of intention might circulate a good encrypted Excel file with name and surname and address of a person who has been abused. And this, of course, put this person at extreme risk. Having data that associate a name and a surname, or maybe not even personal information to that level of detail, the GPS coordinates of where they live, because that is where Kobo collected the data, and you attach an ethnicity to that. This is extremely risky. So I think that it is important to think also of the unintended consequences. And so this basically fall under the full do no harm with data. In some situations, it would be the ideal scenario to have the most disaggregated data you can have on multiple layers, gender being one of them. In some countries, you just cannot do, and it's probably better that you don't try, as long as you have the right justification. Okay, so for instance, if you go to a country where LGBTQI person who belongs to this community is actively discriminated and risk their life, you don't try to get an interview out of them, exposing them to that, because it takes really 2-3 non-personal piece of information to actually allow you to identify a person. If I know your hair color, where you live in the street, I know who you are. I don't need to have your name and surname and telephone number to be able to identify you. So I think it's very important that we also, and again, I'm speaking very strictly of humanitarian context where typically resources are very stretched, and you might lack of resources to guarantee all this. But again, sometimes the ideal scenario is having the disaggregated data for risk after a risk evaluation. It may be better not to try to collect it at that stage, but leave it for later on.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Would the others like to also contribute on data protection concerns?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So just maybe bringing back even from the data protection, the first part they also mentioned, the data ethics, data collection ethics, and then the data sharing ethics. It's really important to, before even we start talking about data protection, because not all the time the data are collected ethically or safely. So how data is collected, from whom, by whom the data are collected are very important. Not all data is necessary, and we need to also remember why we are collecting the data. It's mainly to be to provide a good programming. We are not the anthropologists to try to understand everything about communities, but we really need to know who are impacted the most, why, who are not accessing services, and what made them not accessing services or information, and so on. So we really need to go back to what we need to know, and as a kind of one of the criteria of what kind of data we need to collect. Applying intersectionality doesn't mean we need to collect much more information. It's really, I think, to look at the it's just making more inclusive approaches on when we collect informations and plannings and try to disaggregate the data. And the protection data, it came up a lot, I think, from many panelists, but also when I was working in GBV for the last 10 years, it always comes in a big argument. The GBV data, for example, incidents or prevalence, it's really not relevant at all for at all for the programming, and it's a tip of iceberg. But I have seen many emergencies that different sector collect informations and incidents and then just saved randomly in their Excel or Word document in the computers. And that's why there is always for protection, there's GBB information management system, protection information management systems, and so on. So it's really important to just to summarize, one that I think we really need to consider the data ethics first, and then also what we need to know. Don't collect data unnecessarily, and really limit what we need to know basis. And third, for protection data and some sensitive data, there's already a good standard and then the systems on how to collect and then share and protect information. So I think it's not that everyone has to collect those information. There are people who are collecting and analyzing those information. So we need to follow those informations. And then finally, again, it comes to this very first part that we need to do the inclusive work, even data collection and analysis and interpretation. So different experts can also bring different data and analyze and interpret data. So by this, I think we can really mitigate the problem of data protections in humanitarian settings.
Thank you for that. So perhaps the other two panelists want to add some last remarks. If I may ask you to keep it brief so that we can have the full 10 minutes for the Q&A. Thank you.
If it's okay, if I may go ahead. Just to add to Masumi's point about work being carried out already, something that is very important is, I believe in English, it's termed the crossing of information. There are so many databases already with information. It's so important to be able to potentially develop joint projects in which this information can be crossed. For instance, there's a very interesting initiative in Brazil called Fiocruz, if I recall correctly, and there one is able to map different evidence or different data according to different indicators. But even though, for instance, they don't have a category of displacement triggered by environmental and climatic threats, depending on what indicators you choose, it's very easy to maybe track different trends, and then also basing that on the history of the different regions. So depending on the regions, you would know such a region is more prone to such extreme weather conditions and the other is more prone to other types of weather conditions, and then you can track movements and see at what age people are displaced, gender. So I think it's a very important approach to work with what we have already and have a joint approach of crossing information and being able to build on what has been already worked on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think the interoperability of all this information is crucial. Roy, you may have the final stage before the Q&A.
Thank you. So just about, again, how we collect the sensitive data. I think it's a sensitive topic as well, because like Benedetta said, there is some data that should not be collected because it can harm people. I think at the same time, we need to think how we can use, for example, I'm thinking about referral systems or mechanisms of referring from one service to another. How can we use, and I think it was actually asking one of the questions here, someone mentioned the intersectional approach. And I think that when we're also looking at how we advocate for certain people from certain vulnerable groups through different sectors. So for example, if I want to talk about not even LGBTQ, but if I want to talk about gender-based violence in an area, it would be very dangerous to put that as a critical issue. I can also look at it from a WASH perspective. I can also look at it from different perspectives, from different sectors, not to harm the people. But eventually, I feel like we need to take these, we can use the assets that different sectors have to advocate for vulnerable people. And we can talk about them without actually talking about them or putting them at risk. And I think that's something that also, on a broader sense of, if I'm going to now publish the data in a UN website, that would be problematic. But if I actually care about the services that are happening at the moment on a camp level, in a specific environment, I think the data that is also more locally gathered is also just as important, and we can use more complex-oriented methods to collect them.
Thank you. So we have the first question from the audience. I believe it's very related to what you just stated. So say that we had the less binary data in terms of gender disaggregation. How is it possible to get national authorities and even humanitarian organizations producing the data to get on board? The member says, I wonder if it is the point where an intersectoral approach could come in to make a stronger persuasion and proposals to donors or authorities, that these types of distinctions are also needed in the data. So perhaps, Rai, you want to?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. Also, so at the CPIOR, we're launching now guidelines for intersectoral approach on MHPSS in child protection. And this question came up a lot because we were wondering, for example, how do we talk about, for example, children with disabilities in certain places where the main concern is a WASH concern, right? How do we talk about them and make donors and governments to address them first? And like I said before, I think including the needs of a certain vulnerable group, including them in the necessity of a different sector could help. When I'm looking, for example, at WASH interventions, if I'm looking about what lights should be like in a camp to serve girls who go to the bathroom or kids who go to the bathroom at night. So I'm talking about kids who are vulnerable to sexual exploitation, but I'm not mentioning that. I'm mentioning it has to do with GBV, it has to do with WASH, it has to do with MHPSS, it's all included. But I think we can name those things without bluntly naming there are 15% of these kids who are vulnerable for something, right? Because eventually it can be 100 children who are vulnerable or 15%. I think in the end of the day, it's a question of how we frame that in a way that donors can relate to that and can say, okay, there's a child protection issue, there's a GBV issue, without actually putting them at risk.
Thank you. Masumi, perhaps you want to add on the WASH aspect, given your work experience and that connected to protection issues.
Thank you, Alexandra. So just one is just for convincing part, I think if it is practical and if people see that's the benefit of it, I've seen, like, for example, WASH people that they started collecting or, using more analysis. So I think being practical and show why we collect those data, why we use intersectionality approach, I think would be helpful. Second, again, I think now I think more and more donors really understand better, accepting to having our joint programming. For example, WASH and GBP programming, I've done it in South Sudan in 2015. And now I think in my company, we are doing gender analysis for WASH with the WASH experts, gender experts, communication experts, and assessment experts. So that's really helps to bring our different perspective to understand the information better. So I think it's important is being practical and then make sure practical and then to understand why we are doing this. And then that's I think really helps, I think, people to encourage people to do that and then to bring, I think, practical results to it.
Thank you. So I would just like to remind the audience, feel free to add questions through the Q&A function at this time. Yes, Benedetta.
With the risk of doing some advertisement to the organization for which I'm working in this moment. No, but I can say that there is definitely a strong push to intersectoral analysis. And this is coming from all sectors and major partners involved and donors. It does not mean necessarily that that is translated into using intersectionality as a lens, but definitely this idea that we should be able to understand how needs correlate, what are the driving factors that lead to a certain need or another, and most importantly, to go beyond just the division of vulnerable groups, again, as we were talking before, as boxes or by legal status only, but trying to understand for real who is the most in need and why, what is the kind of profile. That is definitely something that I think is getting, let's say, more and more interest, and the people are increasingly more aware of it. And at least the old DGF community is working towards that, at least. So I just wanted at least to say that from this side, an effort is being done. Over moment of advertisement.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have a question, I mean, to all the panelists, but perhaps more relevant for Kayla because it speaks actually to the work of Resama. But obviously, given the time, you know, we had to talk about human mobility, but that obviously encompasses all forms of slow onset migration, disaster displacement, other factors influencing livelihoods and climate change induced migration. But my question is, do you think that for like legislative angles for migration policy going forward, if disaster displacement and climate change, environmental drivers for migration are increasingly coming together, do you expect that as a trend to evolve, or do you think, obviously, you know, there can be overlaps, there are distinctions, but there can also be overlaps. So I'm curious to understand perhaps Resama's notes of trends on that in the next decade, say in the Latin American or South American context.
Thank you, Alexandra. Well, in terms of Resama's perception, and also when we analyze the Latin American context, well, it's a very big area, so it's difficult to have such a general approach. But I believe that in the face of the most recent findings, for instance, the most recent IPCC report, it is becoming increasingly, at least on a Latin American level, increasingly difficult to separate the categories, which has also become an issue in terms of the initiatives that have been carried out to put pressure on governments and international organizations for the development of the term a category, because there's always the debate, so environmental migrants are not the same as climate migrants, and the debate goes on and goes on. So I believe in terms of having a clear-cut separation, it's becoming increasingly difficult, and I believe it will become even more difficult in the next couple of years, considering the evidence and the way things are developing. And something that in terms of data, and I wanted to just maybe expand a bit on prevention. So something that has been brought about by governments maybe seeking Resama's help has been to inform them in ways that data can be used for prevention action. So not only using data for the aftermath, so dealing with the immediate emergency and the long-term effects of the disaster, but being able to use data as a focus for preventive action. So that has been something that has been quite a struggle in terms of the division of the climatic and environmental factors, but something that is very relevant, because at least on the Latin American level, we see that all or most actions have been dealing with the aftermath as opposed to being preventive. So it will be interesting and challenging to see how in current events it will develop, and how states will react to the most recent evidence concerning this.
Thank you for that. So at this point, I would ask if any panelists have any final comments to add. Otherwise, I think sadly our time is up. Nothing to add? So yes, I would really just like to thank the panelists and everybody watching for dedicating your time to this topic. And I believe a lot of important insights, be it on healthcare provision or funding gaps involving grassroots organizations for more contextual information, understanding where and when it is appropriate to collect data types, and other technical factors involved in rolling out a better approach to humanitarian data operability for the gender vulnerabilities and beyond in a climate environment displacement context. So with this, I thank you all, and I believe all the contributions have made a good path forward. So thank you all, and hope you have a good rest of the evening.